As I said, I'm Richard Burleson. I'm Director of the Injury Prevention Branch. Across the street, the Alabama Department of Public Health Central Office. Been with the department for 22 years. I give a lot of presentations. I've learned that two places you don't want to be on the agenda are between the audience and lunch and between the audience and the door, and here we are between y'all and the door. So I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds. How many of you, I've got to ask a question real quick just to wake everybody up. How many of you are from outside of the greater Montgomery area? So we had a good many people coming from a good distance, and so I bring you greetings from beautiful Slapout, Alabama, which, if you don't know where it is exactly between Flea Hop and Possum Trot. I'm not making any of that up, and I get a lot of mileage out of that when I present outside of the Deep South. How many of you in the room are bureaucrats? Boy, no hand. How many of you are bureaucrats and don't like to call yourself a bureaucrat? Or how many work for a bureaucrat? And how many of you have all of the resources you need? So that's why these strategic partnerships we're going to talk about are so important. The only way that we can take the limited resources we have and get a lot done in a meaningful way in the state of Alabama in terms of prevention, and that's for any issue, not just suicide, is through strategic partnerships where we collaborate and we combine our efforts together. So I'm going to talk to you about three programs that fall under my branch. Let's see. It is. There it goes. All right. One that is sadly no longer with us, one that has been for a long time and hopefully will be for a long time to come, and one that's brand new about to start. So we're going to talk about the Alabama Youth Suicide Prevention and Awareness Program, the Alabama Child Death Review System, and the Alabama Violent Death Reporting System, which is the one that hasn't even really started up yet. And as you can see, and someone alluded to it, I believe it was Corporal Thornton earlier, as you can see, the things we do and the things we talk about don't make for good table conversation. It can be depressing, it can be heady, and but it's important work, and it does have an intrinsic reward. I'm not going to go deep into the weeds on organization, just to show you that we are in the Bureau of Health Promotion and Chronic Disease within the Department of Public Health, and that little yellow box in the corner is my little corner of the world. That's the Injury Prevention Branch. I have a wonderful staff and have a few very good programs that I'm proud of. I'll tell you about a couple of them. The Garrett Lee Smith Act set aside funds for suicide prevention and awareness among youth. It was named for Senator Gordon Smith's son, Garrett. Senator Smith lost his son to suicide and dedicated himself to working to prevent suicide and to make folks aware of the risk of youth suicide. It's funded and administered by SAMHSA. There are three types of GLS grants. It's a little misleading. There are actually two types. The state and tribal are lumped together, but there are state grants that are given to agencies like ours or like departments of mental health across the nation. There are tribal grants that are awarded equal to the state grants, but awarded to tribal organizations, recognized tribes. And then finally, there are college and university campus grants, all aimed toward youth suicide prevention and awareness. They were originally three-year grant cohorts. That's where we got in on it. They are now a 5-year cohort. That just simply means it's a 5-year grant. It's renewable every 5 years, and you go in as a cohort on the front end. Some of you are familiar with the process. All right. We received, after multiple applications, we received the original 3-year grant cycle. We were awarded the grant in August of 2012. You see how it broke out. We had 3 active years of program activities under this grant. Actually, a little more than 3 years. That's why there's an asterisk at the end of January of 16. They gave us an extension, a 6-month extension, to expend the rest of the funds when we were not refunded. Our refund grant application came back, as many of the prior ones that weren't awarded did, where we were recommended, but there were not sufficient funds to grant everyone. And we hated to see that program go because it gave us an opportunity to collaborate with many of our longtime partners, including the Suicide Coalition that David and Judith have already talked about. But it was funded here in Alabama for that 3.5 year period to conduct statewide outreach, to do regionalized training, and to develop resources. And so some of our sub-grantees, actually all of our sub-grantees under this award, were ASPARC, the Alabama Suicide Prevention and Resource Coalition. They were sub-granted specifically to do a lot of QPR training, and they did. Thanks to ASPARC's efforts and the Crisis Center efforts, we actually trained more people in QPR, the gatekeeper training that's already been discussed. We trained more people than a lot of our counterparts in other states who had been doing this for multiple grant cycles. We felt we were very successful in getting that training out to the public. Hated to see the funding in for that. We also sub-granted out to the UAB Counseling and Wellness Center and to several crisis centers across the state. We started with the 3 main ones you see listed, and then at the very last year we added the Family Sunshine Center here in the River region and hoped to add more in the next grant cycle, which we did not receive. We have not given up on it yet. We were asked to resubmit our application this past year. They didn't grant any more awards, so I assume there's going to be another grant cycle coming up, another call for applications. We're going to continue to go after it because a lot of what we put in place under this grant we could pick back up with on very short notice. So we're very hopeful. Again, I've already said we applied several times for it. In 2011, it was kind of an unusual way that we received the grant. In 2011, it was once again recommended but unfunded. And then almost a year later, we had an invitation to resubmit along with some other states. So they felt there was enough good in our grant application to award it, and they came up with some funds later on down the road, and they did end up funding us and 1 or 2 others in a refunding effort. So I won't go into all that. The major program goals were, of course, statewide awareness efforts, which we conducted online, we conducted through social media, we conducted being public health, being the pamphlet people that we are. We conducted it with a lot of paper materials that we came up with that were original to us. The QPR gatekeeper training has already been mentioned. Lifelines is an evidence-based curriculum from Hazelden that we taught in, I say we, our sub-grantees in the crisis centers taught that curriculum in middle schools and high schools throughout the state, several, and again, good numbers on that training. There was some minor funding additional funding for crisis hotlines. Worked with Judith to try and lay the groundwork for a faith-based initiative. It provided the initial funding for the wonderful resource guide that Montevallo now hosts, which is a great resource. I do encourage you to follow those links and look at the resource guide that Judith already mentioned. And we developed some original outreach materials. One in particular I want to share with you. I'm not having much luck with this remote. I apologize. This in poster and pamphlet form, and some of you may have even seen, we did a brief run in the theaters with an animated version of this under Screen Visions, you know, the ads that run. If you're not like me and get there late to every movie, you see commercials before the previews, and this was one of the ads. We rolled that out very early in the 3-year grant cycle, and we thought it was great because we have a wonderful graphics department at Public Health, wonderful video communication folks, as you see back there. They're in our same bureau with us. But this one in particular we rolled out during a national webinar, just thinking, okay, this is what we're doing, this is an example. And before the end of the day after that webinar, we had 5 other states asking to steal that and rebadge it and reuse it, and several more have come forward since. So again, our graphics people went above and beyond developing that one and some other resources that we did. How many of you in here are familiar with the Alabama Child Death Review System? Very few hands. It's one of the most interesting programs that nobody in the state hardly knows about. I've in the past been the assistant director and then the director of that program, and now it's a program within my branch. The Alabama Child Death Review System was established in 1997 by state law. It still continues today, funded largely with money from the Children First Trust Fund. It does in-depth local reviews of child fatalities. Unexpected and unexplained deaths is the way it's spelled out in the law, but I'll put a finer point on it than that. You've heard mentioned today about causes of death. Those of you who have dealt with death certificates are aware there's a cause of death which can be very, very specific, and there's the manner of death, which is just a categorical classification. There are only 5 manners of death available to you to choose. It could be natural causes, accidental, homicide, suicide, undetermined. You'll occasionally see pending on a death certificate, but that just means it's pending, being classified as one of those 5 things. Child Death Review looks at every child fatality in the state of Alabama under the age of 18. So anybody who dies after their live birth and before their 18th birthday by anything other than natural causes. The only natural cause deaths we review are those that are classified as SIDS. And you'll see me using the air quotes. I know they're dated. I still use them when I talk about SIDS because we learned that after 2 or 3 decades of hanging the label SIDS on every infant that died in a bed setting, that most of those were indeed not natural cause, spontaneous SIDS deaths, but rather unexplained infant deaths and should be classified as undetermined. And we've done a lot on that. That's sort of outside of today's realm, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. We look at these deaths, the ones that were preventable or could have been preventable, and we have a multidisciplinary committee for every judicial circuit in the state of Alabama that does an in-depth review of those deaths, funnel information back up to us. We aggregate the information and funnel it up to a national clearinghouse. 43 states, I think, now feed into that national clearinghouse. We also recommend prevention strategies. We have a 28-member state child death review team that meets meets quarterly to review the findings at the local level and to recommend prevention strategies and guide us as we go forward trying to prevent these deaths. So we're not just counting heads. We're trying to identify how and why these children die to prevent them from dying the same way again in the future. Not the same child, but to prevent other children from dying the same way, prevent other families from suffering that same tragedy. And this is how I first got involved with the youth suicide prevention and with the task force that eventually became ASPARC, is because youth suicide is one of the things we specifically look at in child death review. We produce outreach materials, including one of the first brochures that was put out specifically to prevent youth suicide in Alabama. We publish our findings and our recommendations. They're available to the public. We send them specifically to the governor and the legislature every year. And then we contribute, like I said, to the National Child Fatality Review and Prevention Database. All right, and that's just the login for that particular national database. They do aggregate, de-identified, and there's no confidential information shared from any of this, but they do de-identified aggregate data for the entire nation. And the nice thing about having a standardized tool like this is, you know, if we call it an orange here in Alabama, they're calling it an orange out there in California under this data tool because it's standardized definitions, standardized questions, standardized answers. All right, a very similar program that is just starting up. We just received this grant about a month ago from the CDC to contribute into the National Violent Death Reporting System. Again, this is something we have sought after for many years. We've submitted several applications over the years from public health. And so we are going to establish the Alabama Violent Death Reporting System, which will feed into a similar national database. Unlike the Child Death Review System, where it's only non-medical deaths and it's only under 18, the National Violent Death Reporting System collects information on all homicides, all suicides, and all undetermined deaths of certain categories for all ages. So we will be able to look at not just child deaths now, because a lot of my programs are very youth-centric. I mean, most of the funding I receive is targeted toward youth prevention. But this is one that crosses all ages, and we will be looking at all the violent deaths in Alabama, and again, looking where linkages are, looking where, not just collecting the data on a particular homicide, but is this homicide linked to a suicide? And are these victims related? And how are they interrelated? How do these play on each other? So we hopefully will be able to identify clusters, identify trends, geographic trends. We'll do some geomapping with the data. But this one is just getting off the ground. We're in the process of hiring the first staff member for this program right now. So, you know, why is it important that we collect this data and report on these deaths? there's a business adage which I cling to because I went to school for business before I went to school for public health. But it's very true in the field of prevention. You can't manage what you can't measure. If we don't call these deaths what they are, if we don't correctly classify them, if we don't get an accurate death diagnosis, then how do we know where to focus our attention? How do we know where to spend our admittedly limited resources in our efforts trying to prevent these deaths? And this is equally true for suicides. We need to identify the underlying causes and the factors that play into these suicides. We need to take a very multidisciplinary, multi-pronged approach to this if we're going to try to identify and prevent them. The National Violent Death Reporting System, as of this new series of grants, is now in 42 states. They hope to eventually have it in every state. We were part of this last group to come in, and hopefully within a few years they'll have the entire nation feeding into this system, or most. I've already covered all this. You will see that, again, this is going to be a partnership. We're going to have to, and we already have commitments from law enforcement, state and local here in Alabama, from the coroner medical examiner system, Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, and the individual coroners and medical examiners throughout the state, from law enforcement, from the crime labs. All of that information will go into this and be aggregated along with the death certificate and demographic data. Like I said, brand new program. It's a 5-year CDC grant. This coming year, 2017, we'll start collecting data. It's just a pilot program. It'll just be 10 counties in the first year, just so we can get our data system set up and make sure that it's seamless before we go statewide the following year. But those 10 counties include 10 of the most populous counties, so we'll still be looking at over half the deaths even in our first pilot year. Really excited about this program, and it's something that, how many years have we been trying to get NVDRS? A long, long time, probably almost, yeah. So most of the last decade we've been trying to get a grant to do this, and we're very excited about it. And I'm going to, I think they want us to wait questions. Like I said, I wanted to go pretty fast. I apologize, but I want to get y'all out of here on time. So I'll stick around for questions afterwards. Thank you.
I'm currently the Evaluation Unit Director for the Bureau of Health Promotion and Chronic Disease at ADPH. And more specifically, I'm currently the Program Evaluator for the Cardiovascular Program. I'm also an adjunct professor at UAB School of Public Health. And I still think of myself as a suicidologist. You know, my doctoral dissertation was done on suicide, as was mentioned earlier. Dr. Coombs over here was my mentor in graduate school. And we still lecture together. I still lecture a lot on suicide, even though I now work in another area. I also lecture frequently on school violence, particularly mass murders in schools. So I still have a hand in, and I really love it. Unfortunately, there aren't many jobs for a suicidologist. And, you know, ADPH certainly doesn't have any just for that position. So I've had to broaden my skills. It's probably been good for me. I've been really pleased with this conference today. Most of the folks that have spoken here have just been so great. I mean, this has really been eye-opening for me, and it's an area that I haven't really worked in very much before. One thing about me that the people from ADPH and other organizations here that know me know that I use statistics for my presentations. So I'm going to have some graphics here, but they're going to be number graphics. And I use the statistic to try and make sense of what's going on through the numbers. It's like they're holding secrets, and maybe I can find out what a few of them are. So the first slide, whoops. The first slide I'm going to show you is Alabama's suicide and homicide rates. This is a trend analysis for 9 years, And you can see suicide rates in red have steadily gone up, while homicide rates in blue have gone down. Now, they did put this flyer on intentional injuries, as Richard mentioned. Suicides and homicides both fall into intentional injuries, along with acts of terrorism, the undetermined deaths, and the deaths by legal intervention, where a police officer is forced to shoot someone. So be sure and read this. I hope you'll find a lot of good information in it, and it'll maybe help explain some of the graphs if I don't explain them well enough. But this particular slide that you're looking at now actually shows the raw numbers. That's the actual number of deaths in Alabama for all of these years. And, you know, homicide has dropped so much, but we're seeing a new trend, which I'll show you a little bit about later. There was a story on the news, it's been a month or two ago, about the homicide trends in large cities, and I'm going to show you a graphic about that in a little while. But I think most of you are aware, at least from what you've heard today, that suicides are not always recorded as suicides. Dr. Shelton, in the beginning, said that at least 50% of them are not classified as suicides on their death certificates. And that, you know, I've heard different numbers. I've heard from 30 to 75%. Who knows how many? But we're learning that speculation among suicide researchers, again, the numbers are all over there, but some of them say that at least 30% of single vehicle accidents are in reality suicide attempts. But if the person survives that, and particularly if they hit another car and injure someone else, are they going to say it was a suicide attempt? No. No. We don't have data to prove it. But we've interviewed people, many counselors, I'm sure, I know Dr. Coombs has, have interviewed people that tell of that. Another thing is rural communities are particularly bad when the coroner, you know, maybe he can say he's not sure if it's a suicide, there's not enough evidence, but in a rural community, he probably knows the family, and he wants to spare them that stigma of having their loved one shown as a suicide. He also may be thinking that he's doing something to help them out, you know, that maybe if they have insurance it won't pay out for a suicide. Although that is largely a misnomer. Most insurance policies have a 3 to 7 year waiting period. Because after all, if you're suicidal and you go down and buy life insurance, you're not going to wait 3 years before you kill yourself, you know. So that's why there is a deliberate waiting period for that. Certainly another item that was alluded to is suicide by cop. Nobody knows what those statistics may be, but I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories from police officers. And Judith mentioned that, you know, it's the stigma that the young men in particular, particularly African American young men and Hispanic young men, where they have a sort of a macho culture. They don't want to be a wuss by committing suicide, so they force a situation where basically the police officer does it for them. And so again, we don't know how many of those things are truly suicides, because there has to be evidence of suicide in order for it to be determined that way. and only about 25% leave notes. So if we look at suicide by race and gender, and you might notice up here, and in fact in all Alabama state publications, that this is only classified as either white or black and other. And it's not that we're backwards. I really thought it was at first. It's because we have so little divergence in the different races in Alabama. We have less than 4% of all those other races combined. That means Asian, all of them, you know. Native Americans, I think, are 1%. So it's lumped in with African Americans in order to prevent people from knowing who that was. If you saw a slide here that said, say an Asian woman had committed suicide in such and such a county, well, depending on what county that is, some of the more rural counties, you may be able to figure out who that person is. And we have an obligation to prevent that. And this also leads me to, oh, did I move ahead? You notice in the black and other women category, the red one on the far right, there's no number. It just says XX. There are suppression rules, data suppression rules, that all countries that belong to the World Health Organization follow in their death certificates. And currently, those rules, when you code deaths and you put data out there, currently that number is 20. If that number of deaths in that column is less than 20, we can't publish it. That's why it just has an XX. And that's for a couple of different reasons. The potential breach of anonymity is one, and also because when raw numbers are converted to rates, they're converted to rates per 100,000. So, you know, when you divide those out, you get really, really small numbers. And the smaller the number you start off with, the less accuracy in that final rate. The big difference between numbers and rates, the raw numbers tell us the exact numbers of deaths. The rates are used so that they can be compared to any state, any county, any country in the world that, you know, follows or belongs to the World Health Organization. I feel like I'm really building a lot on what Judith had to say earlier, because she touched on so many areas that I actually have slides on. This is the data on suicides after a disaster, and this just looks at Mobile and Baldwin counties, our two shoreline counties. And it starts with Hurricane Ivan, and then Katrina, Rita, then the economic downturn, which lasted several years, as most of us know, and then the Gulf oil spill. And look what happened to the suicide rate. There's a great deal of evidence showing that after a major disaster of some sort, about a year after, anywhere from 6 months to a year afterwards, that's when people commit suicide. Because that's when they realize that their life will never be the same as it was before that disaster. It doesn't necessarily mean it's worse, but everything's changed. And some people have a lot of difficulty with change. And the reason it's delayed is because when when the disaster first occurs, there's that sense of unity and working with neighbors, with other folks. And once that's over, that's when the reality really hits. Maybe they realize, oh my gosh, where the place where I work doesn't exist anymore. I don't have a job now, or their home has been lost, or family members, whatever. But there is a clear pattern here. It looks like just about the time the economic downturn started in 2007, the rates started to go back down, and then the Gulf oil spill hit. They put a lot of people out of work in these two counties. So here's the one I was telling you about, if I can get it to change. There. These are intentional deaths in highly populated counties. And what's interesting about this shows suicide rates and homicide rates. And you saw that earlier graph where they were almost like a C, where, suicide went up and homicide went down. Well, now we're seeing different patterns just in the more populated counties. Jefferson County, suicide has actually gone, in 2014, suicide was less than homicide. In Mobile County, you can see they're very close. Suicide is still higher, but not by much. In Madison County, we didn't really see any change. That still remains stable. But look at Montgomery. Now, in all fairness, I have to say, Montgomery's homicide rate has stayed higher than most of the rest of the state, but it really soared in 2014. And the data for 2015 is not all in yet. It takes about a year for that to come in. So the early data on the first half of the year showing that this impact is even greater. So we'll probably hear a lot more about that in the future. Basically, I divided first responders into two types: the professional responders, the EMTs, firefighters, law enforcement, emergency management personnel, and Red Cross personnel, and then the non-traditional responders, public health, mental health responders, faith-based, community volunteers, and sometimes even passers-by or witnesses. There was a thing on the news last week about a woman trapped in a truck that she was in a car that got hit by a semi on the interstate, and 3 men who stopped for the accident actually pulled this elderly woman out of her car and saved her life. That sort of first responder scenario is when we're talking about the emotional response that people have later, leading even to PTSD, certainly compassion fatigue. It's those bystanders and those people who don't normally do this. They have reactions equal to what the traditional first responders have over long terms, because it's unexpected for them. They're not accustomed to seeing that. And that event, whatever it may be, was totally unexpected for them as well. I also divided disasters into 2 types, or 3 types: weather-related or natural disasters, human-caused responses, and epidemiologic responses, such as outbreaks, where ADPH, we have folks that respond to that, epidemiologists and doctors, and other related areas. Weather-related, we all know tornadoes and hurricanes, they come here. Flooding, that happens a lot. Human-caused responses, chemical accidents, spills of some kind, like the BP oil spill. When I was in graduate school, I worked for a year and a half on interviewing people in a 5-county area around where the chemical weapons site is.
Oh, Anniston.
Yeah, Anniston. And I worked for UAB, that was part of my research in graduate school, and we interviewed people about how they would get out of Anniston if there were a chemical accident there. I don't know if y'all are aware, but before they put in the incinerator that burned up chemical weapons, they were storing chemical weapons from World War II. I mean, mustard gas bombs in there. And I got to tour that weapons site, and they were all stored in these canisters that were thinner than a Coke can. And it was pretty scary. And then we found out they couldn't evacuate because there aren't enough roads leading into and out of Anniston. It was a really eye-opening project to work on. Of course, then the incinerator was built, and they were all successfully incinerated without accident. One of the things that I found in research that I did for this is that very few suicides are classified by occupation. Until about a year and a half ago, our death certificates were sent in by hand, written generally by hand, and then entered right across the street here. And they did not key in occupation. Now, only 30 to 50% of the respondents, who's usually the family of the deceased person, put occupation in there. We saw a lot that just said retired. Well, it didn't tell you what they retired from, what occupation they'd spent most of their life doing. So one of the things I found, NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, their data includes suicides only in the workplace. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Census of Fatal Occupational Injury database, again, in the workplace. Suicide data is generally not known by occupation. The latest Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report, do y'all read that? No, I do. Anyway, August 11th, there was a report that stated the highest rated deaths, occupational deaths with suicides, were in fishing, forestry, construction, and handyman type jobs.
I am Beverly Johnson, the Director of Prevention Services for the Alabama Department of Mental Health, where I have 16 years of experience. I manage the substance abuse prevention services within the state of Alabama that covers all 67 counties within the state. We currently have 14 substance abuse block grant providers that are providing prevention services with the integration of suicide prevention services throughout the state. Certainly proud to see that some of those individuals are within the room today partaking on initiatives that are relative to suicide prevention. We also have 9 strategic prevention framework state incentive grants that are within 20 counties, which are high-need communities within the state of Alabama that we focus on for cultural relevance, for behavioral health disparities, and behavioral health inequities. I did hear Mr. Bland mention Lowndes County, and which is one of our counties that have been identified as an area of need of a lack of access to resources with one ambulance in the area. So those are some of the things that we look at as well from the Office of Prevention perspective to be able to address those needs in those high identified areas. We also have two providers that provide Partnership for Success grant opportunities, which is an extension of the Strategic Prevention Framework that entails the same services that are provided in those high needed areas as well. We just recently, much like Richard, just obtained a SPIF prescription drug discretionary grant that we have yet to do any hiring or anything like that. We've just received notification of that to be able to reduce and prevent prescription drug misuse and abuse. I wanted to give you a little bit of a historical perspective because I would be remiss if I sit here before today and not acknowledge the individuals that established the platform for me to be here today prior to my appointment as the Director of Prevention Services. I certainly want to thank Ms. Aquanetta Knight for providing the historical perspective. Raise your hand, Aquanetta. For providing the historical perspective for me and to formulate strategies and initiatives for me to have something to work with within the Office of Prevention and to be able to provide this to our substance abuse prevention providers throughout the state. I will not go into great detail because that is an archive in and of itself, but I will say that beginning in 1999, the Department of Mental Health did coordinate and convene a group of stakeholders to begin addressing suicide prevention. As Dr. Harrington mentioned, that actually launched in 2001. The Alabama Department of Mental Health was an initial supporter of this initiative with, again, Ms. Aquanetta Knight, Michael Autry, Fannie Hicks, and Kathy House participating in those activities. Also, under the direction of Dolly Hambrick, the Alabama Suicide Prevention Task Force was established with the Department of Public Health and Mental Health as co-chairs. What was derived from that task force was developed an Alabama Suicide Prevention Plan that was published in September 2004 by the Alabama Department of Public Health and posted at its website. In 2005, Ms. Knight and Ms. Hambrick outlined Alabama's Suicide Prevention Plan at the annual Council for Community Mental Health Board's annual meeting. And this is an annual meeting where our stakeholders are in attendance. The task force also worked to review national suicide prevention interventions, adopting the work of Dr. Paul Quinnett as the preferred model. As we move along to 2006, and you heard Dr. Harrington talk before, Dr. Harrington and Dr. Mary Bartlett developed a trainer manual and speaker kit for the Alabama Suicide Prevention Task Force. Dr. Quinnett in February 2007 provided training on suicide prevention and risk reduction, what mental health practitioners need to know, with consultation to the DMH facilities. Membership continued to expand, and the task force worked to develop bylaws, enhances infrastructure, and pursue articles of incorporation. During early 2008, Dr. Harrington and Dr. David Coombs, who I'm currently working with ASPARC, submitted the first Garrett Lee Smith application for national funding. Later that year, Ms. Knight and Dr. Harrington presented suicide prevention at the Alabama chapter of the National Association of Social Workers annual conference. And on September 12, 2008, Governor Bob Riley issued a proclamation for Suicide Prevention Week and recognized the task force. So with all of that, and out of the Suicide Prevention Task Force was the ASPARC, the Alabama Suicide Prevention and Resource Coalition, which we are currently coordinating with today. As we sit here at this table, we all have coordinated efforts with ASPARC and the initiatives relative to suicide prevention. So I do want to thank Ms. Knight, those individuals with the Department of Mental Health that established those standards. And as I continue the work that is set forth before me, it is certainly a pleasure for us to have those coordinated efforts to address the needs of Alabamians. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which we refer to as SAMHSA, is our primary funding source. The primary focus of suicide prevention efforts from SAMHSA are, one, to reduce factors that increase the risk for suicidal thoughts and behaviors, and two, increase the factors that help strengthen, support, and protect individuals from suicide. There have been coordinated efforts from the federal level with SAMHSA's Suicide Prevention Resource Center, Center for Mental Health Services, Center for the Application of Prevention Technologies, and SAMHSA's Center for Substance Abuse Prevention to address understanding the connection between suicide and substance abuse, and that's where Office of Prevention falls in. As we know that factors such as judgment and decision-making during a substance abuse impairment can impact individuals. Understanding that promoting mental health and preventing mental and/or substance use disorders are fundamental, not only to SAMHSA's mission, but the mission to the Department of Mental Health's Office of Prevention. These are some of the following initiatives that we have. As you will see, we have prevent suicides and attempted suicides. We do participate and collaborate with the Suicide Prevention Task Force. We educate our providers on suicide risk factors, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and QPR training, question, persuade, refer. And suicide prevention is a focus in our prevention planning. Our prevention providers provide us with annual prevention plans that are relative to address what the needs are in the respective community through needs assessments. And during that needs assessment, some of those efforts are focused on suicide prevention. Again, knowing that cultural sensitivity, cultural relevance is important for all populations being served, we want to be certain that when we are in communities that we're adequately addressing the populations that are to be served and meeting individuals where they are. We want to be certain that whatever the high-risk population, the at-risk population is, we want to be able to adequately and sufficiently address them in the way that they understand and receive information. Suicide prevention is a core responsibility of health care. As the Office of Prevention focuses on the overall well-being of an individual, suicide prevention must be inclusive as a priority of focus and interwoven into the substance abuse prevention delivery system. As you will see our priorities of focus, you will see the third bullet, prevent and reduce attempted suicides and deaths by suicide. We have emphasis on high-risk populations, especially military families, the LGBTQ community, youth, and American Indians and Alaska Natives. And again, based on community assessments, community needs and county needs assessments, those populations will vary based on what is considered high risk. Both Dr. Shelton and Dr. Harrington mentioned in the earlier sessions about known state data that is relative to suicide. The Office of Prevention has established a strategic plan for fiscal years 2016 through 2019, and we attempt to reduce the suicide completions by 3%. Suicides are incorporated within our assessment data to determine indicators of need. Our goal is to prevent and reduce attempted suicides and deaths by suicide among populations at high risk. We will continue to provide awareness and participate in Suicide Prevention Awareness Month and coordinated partnerships. Many of our providers have integrated mental health first aid into their strategies. Mental health first aid is a training that teaches you how to identify, understand, and respond to signs of mental illness and substance use disorders. On a personal note, I am originally from a small rural community in the state. Knowing that the community that I initially come from, sports is very heavy and has a lot of attention in the area. Coming from an area that is relatively small, a classification of what would be considered in sports as 1A, your coach or your athletic director may be the individual that may be taking you home after practice. So these are the individuals, when we're talking about mental health first aid, we're not necessarily talking about your social workers and your counselors and the ones that have the formal education. We're talking about those individuals that deal one-on-one every day, where these individuals within that particular community, again, being culturally relevant, may have that in with an individual that may be able to disclose information that someone else may not get. Even if that coach is the person that takes that youth home, that coach may be able to do personal observation and to see some potential risk factors that may give an aha moment or may just want to enhance or maximize a conversation at a later time. So we want to make sure that we have those type of resources available in the community, and we want to make sure that our providers continue to coordinate initiatives and strategies throughout the communities to be able to do that. We've also partnered with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office with Corporal Leonard and has been certified in mental health first aid. And we launched that initiative because we wanted to create an opportunity to fully integrate our law enforcement to be able to receive the necessary trainings relative to mental health first aid. So that's another initiative that we've done as well. And we also are aware that the River Region is also providing opportunities for individuals to have mental health first aid as well. In addition, we have recently partnered with the Department of Education on their state suicide prevention initiatives. So I will conclude that we do understand the importance of suicide prevention, and of course, we are well aware of SAMHSA's Zero Suicide Initiative. And as Dr. McKeon eloquently stated, if we are truly striving for perfection, what other number is acceptable? And so we are very much aware that we are running the marathon and continually accessing the water stations that are strategically placed before us so that we can obtain all of the necessary information and resources to assist our state, programming, and more importantly, the individuals we serve. And I am done.